The early evening sun cast long shadows across the streets of downtown Atlanta. The heat of the day still lingered, turning the air thick and humid, as pedestrians moved about with the sluggishness of people who had endured the oppressive weather for hours. On the corner of Peachtree Street, a line of cars idled at a red light, their brake lights glowing in the fading daylight. Among them was Angela Carter, a 32-year-old attorney with a reputation for being sharp, relentless, and fiercely devoted to justice. Dressed in a navy blue business suit, she sat behind the wheel of her black BMW, one hand resting on the steering wheel while the other absent-mindedly adjusted the gold bracelet on her wrist. She had just finished a grueling day in court and was eager to get home, kick off her heels, and finally unwind. As the light turned green, she eased her foot onto the gas pedal, navigating through the bustling streets with practiced ease. Angela was no stranger to the city's traffic or its unpredictable nature. But what she didn't expect was the sudden flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. A sigh escaped her lips. "Seriously?" she muttered, pulling over to the side of the road. She wasn't speeding, she had used her turn signals, and her registration was up to date. So why was she being stopped? She rolled down her window, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel, a precaution that had been drilled into her since she was a teenager. Growing up black in America meant understanding the rules of engagement when it came to law enforcement. It meant knowing that the smallest misstep, the slightest misunderstanding, could escalate into something far worse. Seconds later, a white police officer approached her car. His uniform was crisp, his belt weighed down with the usual tools of authority: a radio, a firearm, a baton. He exuded the type of confidence that came with knowing he held power in this situation. His name tag read Officer Blake Reynolds. "License and registration," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Angela furrowed her brows. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "License and registration," he repeated, this time slower, as if speaking to someone who didn't understand English. Angela remained calm, though irritation prickled at the back of her mind. She reached into her glove compartment, pulling out the necessary documents, and handed them over. "I'd still like to know why I was pulled over," she pressed, keeping her voice steady. Reynolds glanced at the papers before tucking them into his pocket. "Step out of the vehicle." Her heart skipped a beat. "Excuse me, you heard me. Step out of the car." Angela's pulse quickened. There was no reason for this, no explanation, just an order wrapped in the kind of authority that didn't like to be questioned. She had handled countless cases involving racial profiling, had fought in courtrooms for clients who had been victims of systemic bias, but now she was the one sitting in the hot seat. Refusing to show fear, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. As she stepped out, she squared her shoulders, meeting Reynolds' gaze with unwavering confidence. "Face the car," he instructed. Her jaw tightened. "Am I being arrested?" He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed her arm and roughly turned her toward the vehicle. Before she could react, she felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around her wrists. A rush of anger flared in her chest. "This is unlawful," she said, her voice sharp. "You have no grounds to arrest me." "Resisting an officer," Reynolds said smugly. A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk, murmurs of confusion and concern rippling through them. A few pulled out their phones, recording the scene as Angela, a woman who had dedicated her career to upholding justice, found herself on the receiving end of its failures. Her breath came faster, her mind racing. She knew how these situations could unfold. She knew that many who had been in her position had not walked away unscathed. But she also knew something else. Officer Reynolds had just made the biggest mistake of his career, and he had no idea who he was dealing with. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting an amber glow over the city, but the streets of Atlanta remained alive with activity. Cars crawled through rush-hour congestion, their honks blending with the murmur of pedestrians navigating the sidewalks. It was the kind of scene that, on any other evening, would have been unremarkable. But not tonight. Outside the small boutique on Peachtree Street, a crowd had begun to form. What had started as a handful of curious bystanders had quickly ballooned into a restless group of onlookers, their phones raised, recording every second of what was unfolding before them. The murmurs grew louder as Angela Carter stood in the middle of it all, her wrists bound by cold steel, the weight of injustice pressing down on her chest. She had spent years defending people in situations just like this, people who had been unfairly targeted, humiliated, and stripped of their dignity under the guise of law and order. And now she was experiencing it firsthand. Officer Blake Reynolds tightened his grip on her arm. "You're resisting," he said, his voice tinged with the kind of arrogance that came with unchecked power. Angela scoffed. "Resisting? I asked why I was being arrested, and now I'm in handcuffs. That's not resisting, that's questioning your authority. And you don't like that, do you?" Reynolds smirked, shaking his head. "You think you're smart, huh?" Angela met his gaze with unwavering confidence. "I know I am." A few feet away, a woman in her late 50s, dressed in a grocery store uniform, stepped forward. "Excuse me, officer," she said cautiously, her voice laced with concern. "I saw the whole thing. She didn't do anything wrong." "Step back, ma'am," Reynolds snapped. More voices joined in. "She didn't do anything," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "This is racial profiling," another voice called out. The energy shifted. What had begun as curiosity was morphing into something more volatile. Angela took a steadying breath. She could hear the frustration in the crowd, the anger, the disbelief, and she knew that Reynolds had made a critical mistake. He had assumed she was powerless. He had assumed that she was just another black woman who wouldn't fight back. Big mistake. She straightened her shoulders, ignoring the cuffs digging into her wrists. "Officer Reynolds, do you even know who I am?" Reynolds rolled his eyes. "I don't care who you are." "You will," Angela said smoothly. "And when you do, it's going to be the worst day of your career." Reynolds let out a short laugh. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Before she could answer, the doors to the boutique swung open, and a sharply dressed store manager rushed out. He was a middle-aged white man with a neatly trimmed beard, his name tag reading Eric Lawson. His face was flushed, his eyes darting between Angela and Reynolds. "What the hell is going on here?" Lawson demanded. "This woman was caught," Reynolds began, but Lawson cut him off. "That woman is a longtime client," Lawson snapped, "and she didn't do a damn thing wrong." Reynolds' smirk faltered. She looked suspicious. The store called about a possible theft. Lawson shook his head. "That's a lie. Nobody called about anything." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Reynolds blinked, his confidence wavering. Angela tilted her head. "So, officer," she said, her voice dripping with controlled fury, "what exactly is the charge now?" The crowd erupted. "You just assumed she was stealing because she's black. This is disgusting. Take those handcuffs off her." Reynolds' grip on Angela tightened as he glanced around, realizing how quickly he was losing control of the situation. Even his partner, Officer Daniels, who had been standing quietly up until this point, looked uncomfortable. "Blake," Daniels muttered, "maybe we should." "I don't need your input," Reynolds hissed. Angela turned to the crowd, speaking loudly enough for the phones recording her to capture every word. "My name is Angela Carter. I'm an attorney, and what's happening here is illegal." Another wave of gasps. People murmured to each other in disbelief. "She's a lawyer? He arrested a lawyer? Jesus, this guy's done for." Reynolds went pale. "You're lying." Angela smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I don't need to lie, Officer Reynolds. But you're going to wish you had thought twice before you put your hands on me." The growing tension in the air was suffocating. Angela could see it in Reynolds' face, the dawning realization that this wasn't going to end the way he had expected, that the situation had spiraled far beyond his control. The store manager crossed his arms. "Take those cuffs off of her. Now." Reynolds hesitated. Daniels swallowed hard and took a step forward. "Blake, do it." Angela met Reynolds' eyes, watching the war within him. His pride told him to fight, to double down, to maintain his grip on power. But reality was setting in. With shaking hands, Reynolds reached for the key on his belt. The crowd fell into a tense silence as he unlocked the cuffs and removed them from Angela's wrists. Angela rubbed at her wrists before fixing Reynolds with a look that could shatter glass. 7 minutes, she said. Reynolds frowned. What? Angela smirked. 7 minutes. That's how long it took from the moment you put me in handcuffs to the moment you realized your career was over. The crowd erupted into cheers, while Reynolds stood there, frozen. Angela turned to the nearest person with a phone. I want all of you to save those videos. This isn't over. And as the cheers grew louder, Reynolds finally understood. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had ruined himself. The heat of the moment still clung to the air as the crowd outside the boutique simmered with restless energy. Angela Carter stood with her shoulders squared, her wrists free now, but the sting of metal still burned against her skin. Officer Blake Reynolds, on the other hand, was standing rigidly in place. His face drained of color, the weight of his miscalculation pressing down on him like a boulder. Angela had been in many courtrooms, had stared down many men who thought their badges made them invincible. But this was personal. She turned her gaze to Officer Daniels, the junior cop who had hesitated, who had seen the train wreck unfolding and had known, deep down, that this was going to end badly. Do you always let him make the decisions for you? She asked, her voice sharp enough to cut. Daniels stiffened. Enough of this, Reynolds snapped. We're done here. He turned toward the patrol car, gripping his belt, trying to salvage what was left of his authority. Angela's lips curled into a smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. You think you're walking away from this? Reynolds hesitated. He was caught in a losing game, and the fear was beginning to creep into his posture, into his clenched fists, into the way his jaw tightened with every second that passed. Then Angela did something that made the whole crowd lean in. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and made a call. The line rang once before a voice picked up. Director Hughes, this is Angela Carter. I need you to send some people down to Peachtree Street immediately. I was just unlawfully detained by an officer named Blake Reynolds. And I believe we have a situation that requires immediate attention. The crowd collectively inhaled. Reynolds blinked. Wait, what? Who the hell are you calling? Angela ignored him. Yes, that's correct. Yes, there are multiple witnesses. It's all being recorded. She ended the call and turned her sharp, knowing eyes back to Reynolds. You just arrested the wrong woman, officer. 7 minutes later, 3 black SUVs pulled up to the curb, their engines purring with controlled power. The crowd parted instinctively as several well-dressed individuals stepped out, their movements calculated, their gazes sharp. The tension in the air thickened. The first to step forward was David Hughes, director of the Internal Affairs Bureau. His tailored navy suit contrasted sharply against the chaos of the scene. He surveyed the crowd briefly before locking eyes with Angela. Ms. Carter, he said smoothly, are you all right? Angela nodded. I'm fine, but I think we have a much bigger problem here. Hughes turned his gaze to Reynolds, who had suddenly lost all of his bravado. The officer took an instinctive step back, his hands twitching by his sides. Sir, Hughes held up a hand. Not another word. Officer Daniels, now pale, stepped forward. Director Hughes, I said not another word. Hughes' voice was calm, but it carried the weight of finality. The store manager, Eric Lawson, wasted no time stepping in. This officer unlawfully detained a customer who had done absolutely nothing wrong, he said. He had no probable cause, and he refused to listen when I told him she was innocent. Reynolds clenched his jaw. I was just doing my. Hughes' gaze sharpened. I don't believe I gave you permission to speak, Officer Reynolds. Angela folded her arms, watching the power dynamics shift in real time. Then Hughes reached into his coat and pulled out a small tablet. With a few swipes, he turned the screen toward Reynolds. Do you know what this is? Reynolds frowned. What? It's your record. Hughes' voice was dangerously smooth. Internal complaints. Excessive force reports. Civilian complaints filed against you. He tilted his head. Quite a collection you've built up, Officer Reynolds. The crowd murmured, some gasping as they leaned in. Daniels shifted nervously. Reynolds' face turned a shade paler. Those are just reports. No charges. Nothing proven. Hughes smiled. Not yet. Angela decided it was time to twist the knife. Oh, and you should know, she added, her voice dripping with satisfaction. I have multiple civil rights organizations on speed dial, and every major news outlet in Atlanta is about to hear about what happened here. Reynolds swallowed. Daniels shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I tried to tell him. Hughes glanced at Daniels. You'll have your chance to explain later. But right now, he turned back to Reynolds. Officer Blake Reynolds, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. Hand over your badge and weapon. The world seemed to slow. The crowd exploded into cheers. Reynolds flinched as if struck. Wait! You can't. You have the right to file an appeal, Hughes said smoothly. But given your history, I doubt it'll do you much good. Angela smiled, tilting her head. You should have thought twice before putting me in those cuffs. Reynolds' hands shook as he removed his badge and gun, handing them over with stiff fingers. Then, as if the moment couldn't get worse, Hughes turned to Daniels. As for you, he said. Daniels' throat bobbed. Sir, you followed orders, but you knew this was wrong. You could have stopped it and you didn't. That makes you complicit. Daniels' eyes widened. Hughes sighed. Your suspension is pending review. Hand over your firearm. Daniels hesitated, then did as he was told. Angela took a slow breath. Justice wasn't always swift. It wasn't always immediate. But today it was satisfying. She turned back to the cameras still rolling. To everyone recording this, she said, don't stop. Make sure the world sees this. And with that, the truth was out. Officer Blake Reynolds had never felt so exposed in his life. The weight of his badge was gone, and in its place was the cold, sinking realization that his career had just imploded in front of a live audience. His heart pounded as the sounds of the crowd buzzed in his ears. Laughter, cheers, and the murmurs of people recording his downfall. Angela Carter stood firm, unshaken, watching him with the measured patience of someone who had seen this play out before. Only this time, she wasn't the victim. She was the one in control. Across from them, director David Hughes adjusted his tie and took a step closer to Reynolds. His voice, cool and authoritative, cut through the chaos. Officer Reynolds, I suggest you take a moment to reflect on what just happened, he said. Because if you think this ends with you simply losing your job, you're mistaken. Reynolds' head snapped up. What the hell does that mean? His voice was hoarse, desperate. It means, Hughes continued, that your actions tonight are not just a simple case of misconduct. They're an indictment of a deeper problem in this department. And trust me, you're not the only one who's going to face consequences. Reynolds clenched his jaw. I was doing my job. You abused your authority, Hughes corrected. You profiled an innocent woman, humiliated her in front of witnesses, and ignored multiple warnings that you were making a mistake. And now, because of your arrogance, the department has a PR nightmare on its hands. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People were already typing, already uploading, already ensuring that this moment wouldn't be forgotten. Then came Angela's voice, measured, unwavering. You were so sure that your badge made you untouchable, she said, tilting her head slightly. Tell me, how does it feel now? Reynolds' fists curled, but before he could respond, a commanding voice interrupted the moment. Enough! The crowd parted slightly as Police Chief Anthony Delgado stepped forward. His broad frame and the deep lines in his face suggested years of experience. But tonight, those lines were etched with something sharper. Anger, disappointment, and the weariness of someone who had seen this play out too many times before. His eyes flicked between Angela and Hughes before landing on Reynolds. Officer Reynolds, Delgado said, his voice like gravel. Hand over your uniform. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Reynolds' face drained of all color. Chief, Now, Delgado said, cutting off any further argument. Reynolds hesitated, but the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Slowly, reluctantly, he unbuttoned his police shirt, the patches and insignia, the symbols of his authority, now meaningless. When he finally stood in just his undershirt, stripped of everything that once gave him power, Delgado spoke again. "You're not just fired," the chief said. "You're under investigation. Civil rights violations, misconduct, and excessive force. And trust me, this isn't going to be something you can just walk away from." Reynolds' breath came in quick, panicked bursts. This is insane. You're going to throw me under the bus over one mistake." Angela let out a small, humorless laugh. "Mistake? No. A mistake is spilling your coffee. A mistake is misfiling paperwork. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And now you're going to live with the consequences." Delgado turned to the other officer, Daniel Daniels, who stood stiffly, his eyes darting between his former partner and the police chief. "You're suspended," Delgado said. "Pending review." Daniels swallowed hard. He had seen this coming, had known the moment things started spiraling that he would have to answer for his inaction. Still, the finality in Delgado's voice sent a chill down his spine. The chief turned back to Angela. His expression softened just slightly. "Ms. Carter, I know an apology isn't enough, but you have my word that this department will cooperate fully in any investigation you choose to pursue." Angela studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good, because I fully intend to see this through." The sun had begun to rise over Atlanta, painting the skyline in hues of orange and pink. In a quiet office, Angela sat across from Hughes, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. "It's not over yet," Hughes said, tapping his fingers against the desk. "Reynolds might be fired, but cases like this don't just disappear. There will be pushback. There always is." Angela took a slow sip. "I know. And Daniels," Hughes continued, "he could still come back if they decide suspension is enough." Angela exhaled sharply. "Then we make sure it's not." Hughes studied her for a long moment before nodding. "You're not just fighting for yourself, are you?" Angela shook her head. "No, this is bigger than me." Silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Outside, the world was waking up, unaware that, overnight, a storm had begun to brew, one that would shake the foundations of the Atlanta Police Department. Angela took one last sip of her coffee, then set it down with finality. "Let's get to work." The sun had barely risen over Atlanta when the fallout from the previous night began to take shape. Social media was ablaze. News outlets had picked up the story, and the video of Officer Derek Reynolds unlawfully arresting Monica Carter was already being dissected on national television. By the time the Atlanta Police Department held a press conference that morning, the damage was irreversible. Standing behind the podium in front of a sea of reporters, Police Chief Anthony Delgado cleared his throat. The cameras zoomed in, microphones angled to catch his every word. After a full review of the events that transpired last night, the Atlanta Police Department has officially terminated Officer Derek Reynolds for misconduct, racial profiling, and excessive force. His actions do not reflect the values of this department, nor will they be tolerated. We are committed to transparency, accountability, and ensuring that incidents like this do not occur under our watch. A flurry of questions erupted from the reporters. "Chief Delgado, will Officer Reynolds face criminal charges? Does this reflect a systemic issue within the force? What about Officer Daniel Daniels? Will he also be removed?" Delgado raised a hand, signaling for calm. "An internal investigation is underway regarding all officers involved. Further disciplinary actions will be announced as we continue to assess the situation." Behind him, Director David Hughes, Monica's legal counsel, stood firm, arms crossed. He had fought enough battles to know that police departments never admitted fault unless they had no other choice. Today, the world had forced their hand. But the real moment of reckoning came when Monica herself took the stage. The reporters' voices died down as Monica adjusted the microphone. Dressed in a sleek navy blue suit, she radiated composure. but there was a fire behind her eyes that hadn't dimmed since the moment she was thrown against the hood of her car. "My name is Monica Carter," she began, "and last night, I was arrested for nothing more than existing as a black woman in America." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I was detained without reason, humiliated in front of witnesses, and spoken to like I was less than human. Officer Reynolds saw the color of my skin and decided I was a threat. But the real threat, the real danger, was the unchecked power he wielded, the system that allowed him to believe he could do this without consequence." She paused, letting her words sink in. "This is not just about me. This is about the countless black men and women who don't have cameras recording when they're targeted. This is about the people who never get justice. And that's why I'm standing here today, to make sure that change happens, so that one day, no one has to fear for their safety simply because of the way they look." The audience erupted into applause, some even rising to their feet. The video of Monica's speech went viral within hours. News anchors debated the implications, politicians were forced to respond, and activists across the country called for deeper investigations into racial bias in policing. The Atlanta Police Department, already under scrutiny, faced mounting pressure. But perhaps the biggest shift wasn't in policy, it was in awareness. The public was watching now. The officers who once thought they could act with impunity knew that their actions had consequences. As the days passed, Derek Reynolds' world collapsed. His name was in every headline, his past cases were being reopened, and his attempts to justify his actions fell on deaf ears. At a closed hearing, he sat across from his former colleagues, hands clenched into fists. "You ruined my life," he spat at Delgado. The police chief didn't flinch. "No, Reynolds, you did that to yourself." Reynolds had been a decorated officer once, but now he was a disgrace. His career was over. No police department would touch him. And outside the courthouse, protesters chanted his name, not as a hero, but as a warning. Monica watched the events unfold with measured satisfaction. She hadn't set out to destroy a man's career. She had set out to expose a corrupt system. And now, the system was being forced to answer for its sins. Sitting in her lawyer's office, David Hughes placed a folder in front of her. "This is the settlement offer from the city," he said. "It's a big number." Monica exhaled. "Money won't change what happened." "No," Hughes agreed, "but power will. And now, you have it." She looked out the window, where a group of young activists held signs demanding justice. This was bigger than her. She turned back to Hughes. "We're not just taking their money, we're taking their system apart, piece by piece." Hughes smiled. "Then let's get started." As Monica walked out of the office, the air felt different. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a force of change. And for the first time in a long time, justice wasn't just a dream. It was real.